Hey there, how you doing? It is I, the Terrorific Lady, otherwise known as Brandy, and welcome to Retro Horror School. If you like learning about horror from the 1970s to the 2010s, listening to horror reviews and retrospectives, taking part in horror discussions, and asking horror questions, then click the subscribe button because I put out new videos every Friday at 2 p.m. Central. Now, if you remember a couple weeks ago, I talked a lot about 70s horror and how it laid the groundwork for a lot of the tropes that we see in horror today. Well, buckle up because now we got another video discussing horror tropes, this time from the radical 80s. I'm going to talk about the trends and tropes in 80s horror and why they connected with audiences at the time. Here we go. So a little bit of background about the 80s. It was a pretty interesting time. Now, I was born in 82, so I was young for a lot of the 80s. But for those of you who were a teen or even an adult in the 80s, you remember things like Ronald Reagan being president, the Cold War, a rampant rise in consumerism, almost to the point where it ran amok. And 80s horror took, like 70s horror, took a lot of the fears that people had and translated them to the big screen. Slashers and the slasher killer. You may be wondering if my brain is glitched because I talked about slashers and the slasher killer in my 70s horror tropes video. Well, nope, my brain has not glitched. 70s horror laid a lot of the groundwork for the 80s slasher. 80s is when the slasher absolutely exploded. So you had the slasher killer who was targeting young teens who like to do things like smoke, drink, party, and have sex. Franchises like Friday the 13th and A Nightmare on Elm Street got their start in the 80s. There were two things going on with this trope in the 80s. First off, this trope almost served as a warning of sorts, like, oh, these behaviors bad, so if you indulge in them, shit's gonna happen. Like, yeah, like a slasher, like killer coming to kill you. I don't know. Another thing this trope addressed is the underlying fear of just this unstoppable force, this unstoppable evil that you could not control, coming in and destroying your innocence, like, in a way. And just the way that you once looked at the world, it's completely different. So you had Ronald Reagan, as being president, as mentioned, the Cold War, the whole thing going on in Germany with the Berlin Wall, the space shuttle Challenger exploding. So many different events happened that almost bridged the gap, I suppose, from just this innocent look at the world to almost just like, oh, well, this is real life. And 80s slasher killer horrors depicted those underlying fears of just losing your innocence. Camp and cheese. The 80s saw a rise in this horror trope to where horror was not taking itself all too seriously. You saw it leaning more towards it, poking fun at itself, satirizing the genre, things of that nature. So you have films like Killer Clowns from Outer Space, The Return of the Living Dead, poking fun at the conventions of their specific subgenre. This subverting the expectations of what's expected in a horror movie and in the horror genre itself was the young ones of that time to push back against the establishment, push back against cultural norms. Body horror and practical effects. You saw a lot of this trope going on in horror in the 80s. So films like Scanners, Videodrome, The Thing, all of those films and a ton more had just nasty, awesome, gruesome special effects. Gore, guts, blood, just, flying everywhere. And in the case of Videodrome, you had like a mouth like forming in James Wood's stomach. So this kind of body horror and gore just pointed to just like the utter fascination and almost terror behind the fact that there were just like unstoppable forces that you could not control. In this instance, technology. Technology exploded heavily in the 80s. Look at all just like if you remember like toys in the 80s, a lot of them were just like very, very far ahead of their time, like Teddy Ruxpin, Grubby, like things like that. Come on. So technology was moving really, really fast. People were trying their hardest to catch up, and it was just a terrifying thing. The final girl trope. Whoever you may consider the first final girl, whether it's Sally Hardesty, whether it's Jess, whether it's Laurie Strode, the 80s fully cemented the trope of the final girl. You had final girls taking less of a passive backseat role and more of a active kick-ass role, like Ginny in Friday the 13th Part 2, Nancy Thompson in Nightmare on Elm Street, and a whole lot more that would take forever to mention in this video. So this reflected the fact, not just a fear, but a fact that by the end of the 1970s, you had more women holding jobs outside of the home. So moving from the home and only being caretakers out into the workforce. And this trend continued to heavily rise during the 80s. So the final girl trope in the 80s reflected this fact that society was starting to see women as more powerful and in charge and able to take control of the situation, like the final girls being able to kick the killer's ass. Unstoppable and insatiable consumption. So in the 1980s, you had a definite rise in spending with things like shopping malls, TV home shopping networks, which were the precursor to the internet, where people were able to buy things from directly from the comfort of their home, and just the fact that people materialistically we're always wanting more. They can never be satisfied. And horror, for instance, like The Critters and The Stuff, reflected the fact that these monsters just were never satisfied. They were always wanting more, and thus what sparked this trope. All right, so those were some of the most popular horror tropes of the 80s and what they reflected and why they connected with audiences. Are there any other tropes from the 80s that I may have missed? If so, let me know in the comments below. Also, I have links in my description to my other social medias and my Ko-fi, where you can support my YouTube channel and my Instagram. So definitely check it out. No, dismiss everybody. I will see you next time. Bye.